The Arizona Territory in 1874 was not a place of kindness. It was a land of baked rock and poisoned water where the sun burned away all forgiveness. For 17-year-old Juliet Bell, trapped on a failing homestead at the edge of Coyote Jaw Canyon, life was a cycle of dust, hunger, and the simmering rage of her father, Martin. The world was divided into two simple, brutal camps, settlers and savages. But the desert doesn't care about a man's laws. And when a cry too small for a coyote, too human for a bird echoed up from the canyon floor, Juliet was forced to make a choice that would stain the dust with blood and bind her life forever with enemy silver. The dust was a living thing. It coated the inside of Juliet Bell's mouth, settled in the lines of her palms, and painted the failing corn stalks a uniform ghostly grey. It was, she often thought, the only thing that truly thrived on the homestead. Their cabin, 2 rooms of sweating cottonwood and dried mud, was perched 3 miles from the nearest neighbor and a mile from the jagged maw of Coyote Jaw Canyon. The canyon was a place of ill omen, a scar in the earth that the local Apache and the recently returned Navajo the Diné used as a highway. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of chicory and unspoken grief. Juliet's father, Martin Bell, sat at the rough-hewn table, his hands cracked and stained, wrapped around a tin cup. He was a tall man, stooped not by age but by failure. The war had taken his spirit, the journey west had taken his wife, and the territory was taking what little was left. "It's the heat," Juliet said, her voice dry as the air. She was mending a burlap sack, her needlework precise and angry. The livestock ain't used to it. Martin's cup hit the table with a thud. "It ain't the heat. It's them." Juliet didn't need to ask who them was. It was the same shadow that hung over every failed crop, every dry well, every missing head of cattle. The Diné, the Navajo, the sorrel mare is gone. Martin said, his voice low and flat. "Slipped her rope last night. Or it was cut." Juliet stopped her needle. The sorrel was their last good horse, the only one strong enough to pull the wagon into the settlement at Verde. Farther she might have just wandered, looking for water. She wandered into a Navajo cookpot. Martin spat. "They're down there, in the canyon. I seen smoke 2 days back. They're supposed to be on the bosque on the reservation. But they're here, creeping." His hatred was a third person in the room, as real and suffocating as the heat. He'd arrived with dreams of a ranch, a new start. He'd found only rocks, drought, and a people who did not want him there. He saw their presence as a personal affront, a deliberate act of sabotage orchestrated by the land itself. "I'll look for her," Juliet said, standing. She was slender, but the land had baked the softness from her. Her hair, the color of wet sand, was pulled back in a severe bun. "You'll do no such thing," Martin snapped, rising. "You'll stay within sight of this cabin. I mean it, girl. There's worse things moving out there than just horse thieves." He was referring to Ephraim Wade. The name was rarely spoken, but it haunted the territory. Wade was a man who worked the blurred line between lawman and butcher. He'd been a scout for the army then, a relocation agent, and now he led a band of freelance regulators who for a price would clear a patch of land of its native inhabitants. They were known to be in the area, and their presence made the air feel brittle, ready to spark. "I'm just checking the well line." Juliet lied, grabbing her rifle, a heavy single-shot Springfield older than she was. "Don't go near the canyon, Juliet. That's their land. Let them have it. Let them rot in it." Juliet stepped out into the blinding white sunlight. The lie sat heavy on her tongue. She wasn't checking the well line. She was going to the canyon. Not just for the mare. She was going because the cabin was shrinking and her father's bitterness was suffocating her. The canyon, for all its dangers, was the only place she could breathe. She walked west, her boots kicking up puffs of alkali dust. The heat was a physical weight. Buzzards circled lazily in the high white sky. She kept to the low arroyos, her eyes scanning the rock formations. Her father was a fool to think the mare just wandered. But he was also a fool to blame the Navajo for everything. He blamed them for the drought, for the fever that took her mother, for his own inability to bend the land to his will. Juliet was different. She saw the land not as a thing to be conquered, but as a presence to be survived. She knew the plants that held water, the trees that signaled a hidden spring, the way the lizards moved before a dust storm. She reached the rim of Coyote Jaw Canyon. It was a staggering drop, 1,000 feet of red and purple rock plunging into shadow. The wind whistled through the hoodoos, sounding like a distant moan. It was a dangerous, forbidden place. She started her descent, moving with the practiced ease of a mountain goat, her rifle slung over her shoulder. The air grew cooler, damper. The smell of sandstone and dry brush filled her nose. She was halfway down, picking her way across a wide ledge when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a mare. It was a cry. A thin, reedy wail that cut through the air and stopped her heart. She froze, scanning the canyon floor below. There was nothing, just rock and shadow. The sound came again, higher this time, terrified. It was coming from below her, from a narrow crevice just off the main path. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Don't go near. It's a trap. They'll use a baby to lure you in." She gripped the rifle, her knuckles white. The crying hitched, turning into a desperate, dry sob. It was the sound of a very small child. Common sense screamed at her to run, to climb back up to the sun-baked rim and pretend she'd heard nothing. But the sound was not a savage sound. It was the sound of a child, and it was alone. Slowly her rifle raised. Juliet Bell moved off the path and began to climb down toward the shadow that had cried. The crevice was barely wide enough for her shoulders. She had to sling the rifle ahead of her and edge sideways, her back scraping against the coarse sandstone. The air grew still and hot, thick with the smell of bat guano and something else, something metallic and sharp. The crying had stopped, replaced by a hitching, terrified silence. "Hello?" Juliet called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. Is someone there?" A frantic, scrambling sound answered her. She rounded a sharp bend, and the crevice opened into a small, dark pocket in the rock, perhaps 10 feet wide. And in the farthest, darkest corner, he was huddled. He was a child, a boy no more than 3 years old. He was wearing only a small, torn buckskin shirt, and his skin was covered in dust and scratches. His black hair was matted with sweat, but it was his eyes that seized her, huge, black, and utterly wild with terror. He was Dine, a Navajo toddler. He stared at her, his small body trembling so hard she could see it from across the cave. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "It's okay," Juliet said, lowering the rifle. She held up her hands, palms out. I won't hurt you." The boy just watched her, his chest heaving. Juliet took a slow step forward, and then she heard it. A sound so quiet, it was more of a feeling of vibration in the rock. A dry, papery shush, shush, shush. She froze. Her eyes darted from the boy to the shadowed rocks near the mouth of the cave. Tucked in a coil almost invisible against the red rock was a large diamond-back rattlesnake. It was coiled between her and the child. Its triangular head raised its tongue, flicking its black eyes as flat and dead as obsidian. The boy saw her look. He let out a tiny stifled squeak. The snake's tail vibrated the sound, filling the small cave, echoing off the walls, a dry, angry promise of death. Juliet's mind went sharp and cold. There was no time to think, no time to aim the rifle, no time to be scared. The snake was watching her, but it was positioned to strike at him, the small, terrified creature huddled in the dark. "Don't move," she whispered, though she knew the boy couldn't understand her. "Don't move." She unslung her canteen from her belt. The movement was slow, agonizing. The snake's head tracked her hand. The rattling grew louder, more insistent. With a flick of her wrist, Juliet tossed the canteen. It sailed past the snake, clattering loudly against the back wall of the cave. The snake, startled by the motion and the sound behind it, lunged not at the boy, but at the rolling canteen. It struck the metal tin with a vicious thwack. In that split second, Juliet moved. She didn't use the rifle. She grabbed the heavy stick she'd been using as a walking staff, took 2 long strides, and brought it down with all her strength, pinning the snake's head just behind the skull. It thrashed violently its body, a whipping, coiling mass of muscle. Juliet pressed down her teeth, gritted her arms, screaming with the effort. The snake coiled around the stick, but she held it fast. With her other hand, she fumbled for the hunting knife at her belt, drew it, and plunged it deep into the snake's spine, severing its head. The body went into a frenzy of post-death spasms, but the danger was over. Juliet dropped the knife, her body shaking in reaction. She leaned against the cave wall, breathing hard, the smell of snake and ozone thick in her throat. When her vision cleared, she looked at the boy. He was in the exact same spot, his eyes, somehow even wider. He was staring at the still twitching snake, then at her, then back again. He wasn't crying anymore. He was just watching. "It's dead," Juliet said, her voice trembling. "It's gone. You're safe." She took a step toward him. He flinched, pressing himself so hard against the rock he seemed to merge with it. "Hey!" "It's okay." She knelt, keeping her distance. She could see now how bad he was. His lips were cracked and blue. His skin had no elasticity. When she'd seen him flinch, the skin on his arm seemed to stay in a pinched ridge. He was dying of thirst. "Water," she said, pointing to the canteen. She retrieved it, ignoring the venom slimed on its side. She uncorked it and slid it across the dusty floor. "Water." He stared at it, unmoving. "Please," Juliet urged, her voice softening. "Drink." He crept forward, his movements like a spider. He grabbed the canteen and in his haste he spilled almost as much as he drank, gulping the water down in desperate, choking swallows. Josephson sat back on her heels, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow. The questions crashed in. Who was he? Where was his family? How long had he been here? And the most dangerous question of all, what in God's name am I going to do with him? Taking him home was a death sentence. Her father Martin would see the boy as a bargaining chip, a stray or worse, an infestation. He might turn him over to Wade, or he might just walk the boy back to the canyon rim and leave him. Leaving him here was also a death sentence. He was too weak to climb, and his family, wherever they were, was clearly not coming back for him anytime soon. Another snake, a coyote the heat. He wouldn't last the night. She looked at the small boy who had finished the water and was now clutching the empty canteen to his chest like a holy relic. He was watching her with an intelligent, wary gaze. She had just saved his life. She was now responsible for it. "All right," Juliet whispered, more to herself than to him. "All right, we can't stay here." She had to hide him. Hide him from the canyon, hide him from the sun, and most of all, hide him from her own father. She thought of the old line shack, a half-collapsed dugout 3 miles north, built by a prospector who had long since vanished. It was invisible from the trail, and her father never went there. "Come on," she said, standing up and holding out her hand. "We've got to go. Now." The boy didn't take her hand. He just stood up, his small legs trembling, and waited for her to lead. Juliet picked up her rifle, grabbed the boy's small hot hand, and pulled him out of the darkness into the blinding, dangerous light of the canyon floor. The journey to the line shack was a quiet agony. The boy, whose name she didn't know, was weaker than he looked. His small legs, scratched raw by thorns, kept buckling. After a few hundred yards of his stumbling, Juliet gave up, slung her rifle over one shoulder, and lifted him. He weighed almost nothing. He was a bundle of hot, dry skin and sharp bones. He didn't fight her. He just rested his head against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and fast. Juliet's heart hammered against her ribs. This was a new kind of fear. It wasn't the sharp, cold fear of the snake. It was a heavy, aching dread. Every rock formation looked like a man, every gust of wind sounded like a horse. She was carrying a Navajo child. In this part of the territory, that was an act of treason. The line shack was little more than a hole in the side of a hill, shored up with rotting timbers and fronted by a collapsed sod roof. But the interior was dark, cool, and most importantly, hidden. She set the boy down on the dirt floor in the farthest corner. "You stay here," she commanded, using the tone she used on her father's hounds. "Don't. Make. A. Sound. You understand? No sound." The boy just stared, his black eyes seeming to absorb all the light in the small space. "I'll be back," she said, "with food and more water." She ran all the way back to the homestead, her lungs burning. The sun was starting to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. She burst into the cabin, her chest heaving. Martin was there, cleaning his pistol at the table. He looked up, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "You were gone a long time just to check a well line," he said, his voice a low rumble. I thought I saw the mare." Juliet lied, her mind racing. "Down by the West Ridge. I tracked her for a while, but it was just a deer." She went to the water barrel, her back to him, and drank deeply, trying to calm her shaking hands. "Find any sign? Just tracks. Heading south. Maybe she'll circle back." Martin grunted, ramming a cleaning rod down the pistol's barrel. "Doubtful. She's Navajo meat by now." Juliet's stomach twisted. She had to get food. She moved to the dry safe, a small wooden box punched with holes. She pulled out a strip of hardtack and a piece of dried venison. "What are you doing?" Martin asked. "I'm hungry. I didn't eat lunch. You'll spoil your supper." "I don't care." She stuffed the hardtack in her pocket. She needed more. She needed the laudanum. The boy was feverish, she was sure of it, and if he cried, he would be discovered. "Father," she said, turning to face him, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "I'm going to check the chicken coop. Make sure a fox hasn't been digging." Martin just nodded his attention back on his gun. The moment she was outside, she didn't go to the coop. She darted to the small shed where her mother's things were still stored. Her mother's medicine box was there. Inside, beneath a few dried bundles of sage, was a small, dark brown bottle tincture of laudanum. For the pain, the doctor had said. She grabbed it. Then she went to the coop, stole 2 eggs, and hurried to the well. She filled her canteen, and grabbing a spare wool blanket from the line, she slipped back into the twilight. When she got back to the shack, the boy was exactly where she had left him, a small, silent shadow in the corner. He looked up when she entered, but he didn't make a sound. Here she said, her voice gentle now. She broke the hardtack into her cupped hand and poured a little water on it, making a rough, wet mash. She held it out to him. He ate it from her palm, his small, rough tongue startlingly gentle. He ate like a starving animal without breathing, his eyes fixed on her face. She gave him the venison which he tore at with his small teeth. She gave him the raw eggs which he slurped down without hesitation. Finally, she gave him the canteen. When he was done, he let out a long, shuddering sigh, and his body, finally refueled, slumped against the wall. "What's your name?" Juliet asked, knowing it was useless. He just watched her. "My name is Juliet." She touched her chest. "Juliet." He said nothing. "Ashki," he whispered. The word was so quiet she almost missed it. "Ashki." He nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "Ashki. Boy." "Okay, Ashki," she said. "You're sick." She could feel the heat radiating from him. She uncorked the laudanum. This is for the fever. It will make you sleep." She poured 2 small drops into the cap and mixed it with a splash of water. She held it to his lips. He drank it, his face scrunching at the bitter taste, but he didn't fight. She spread the wool blanket over him. He was asleep, in moments the laudanum and exhaustion pulling him under. Juliet sat back, the darkness of the dugout closing in. The reality of her situation settled on her like a shroud. She was harboring a Navajo child. She had stolen food and medicine from her father to do it. She thought about the snake. She had killed it without a second thought, a surge of pure protective instinct. It was the same instinct that had her here in a dark hole, guarding a child who was supposed to be her enemy. Her father's hatred was simple, clean and absolute. It was a rock he had built his broken life on. Juliet's world, which had been so simple that mourning, dust chores survival, had just become hopelessly, terrifyingly complex. She looked at the sleeping child, Ashki. He was not an it. He was not a savage. He was a little boy, lost and sick. She stayed there for an hour, watching his chest rise and fall in the dark, her rifle across her lap. She was no longer just a settler's daughter. She was a traitor. And she was, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly alone. 20 miles east, in a dry riverbed, Ephraim Wade spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the cracked earth. He was a broad, heavy man, his face scorched by the sun and overgrown with a grizzled beard. His eyes were the color of a faded prairie sky, pale, empty, and cold. They scattered, he said, his voice like gravel. His companion, a thin, weasel-faced man named Lomax, nodded nervously. Lomax was new to Wade's outfit and eager to please. "We got the man, Mr. Wade. And the woman, that's 2. 2 ain't all," Wade said, rechecking the cinch on his horse. The wagon was full of goods. They were running, and the fire was big enough for 4 or 5. "There's strays." And I don't like strays. They were looking at the remnants of a small, desperate camp, a broken wagon wheel, a few scattered pots, and 2 fresh-mounded graves which Wade and his men had dug themselves after finishing their work. They hadn't just killed the adults, they had taken their hair. The scalps were drying on Wade's saddle horn. "But the army patrol," Lomax started. "The army patrol is useless." Wade cut him off. "They'll be here in 2 days, find the graves and call it a settler dispute. They don't want the paperwork. We do the work they can't. And we get paid for it." He mounted his horse, a big, mean-looking black gelding. The tracks are small, a child maybe, and maybe one other, an older woman. They headed toward the canyon. Coyote Jaw Lomax's face tightened. "That's Diné land. They'll be protected there." "Protected?" Wade laughed, a short, barking sound. "They ain't protected by God himself, not if I find 'em. I want the set. We get the whole family the bounties double. The ranchers paying for this patch of land want it clean. No strays. No one left to come back and seek revenge. That's the rule." He spurred his horse, and the black gelding lunged forward, heading west toward the setting sun and the canyon. "We'll find 'em. A child can't move fast." At the same time, from the north, another party was moving. This group was not riding. They were moving on foot, ghost-like, through the rocks and scrub. There were 5 of them, all Dine men, their faces marked with the black and white paint of grief and purpose. They were led by a tall, stern man in his 30s. His name was Hastin, and he was Ashki's uncle. They moved with a speed that defied the terrain, their eyes missing nothing. They had found the destroyed camp hours ago. They had found the tracks of Wade's horses, and they had found the tiny wandering footprints of a child and the smaller shuffling tracks of an older woman. With them, riding a grey-muzzled pony, was the woman herself. She was Azomone's, the tall woman. She was Ashki's grandmother. She was the matriarch of their small, broken clan, and her face was a mask of unbending iron. She had been digging for roots when Wade's men attacked. She had watched hidden in the rocks as they murdered her son and his wife. She had seen her grandson, Ashki, flee into the rocks. She had been following him ever since. Hastin paused, kneeling to examine the ground. He held up his hand for silence. "The tracks separate," he said in his language. "The boys, they go south, into the canyon, alone." Asdoneez let out a sound, a low keen of pure despair. Her grandson, alone in the canyon. "The white men, Wade's men, they are following us," Hastin said, pointing to the tracks of shod horses, still fresh crossing their path. "They are hunting." The grandmother looked at her nephew, her black eyes burning in her wrinkled face. "Find my grandson. The Shash bears will find the white men. We will find the boy. They will find him first," Hastin said, his voice grim. "They are on horseback. We are on foot. Then we must be faster. Asdoneez," replied her voice, leaving no room for argument. She dismounted the pony. "We run." She turned her face toward the canyon. She knew the white men. She knew what they did to strays. She knew what they did to children. It was a race, and the prize was her grandson's life. The 5 men and the old woman broke into a steady ground-eating trot shadows, moving against the red rock, their hearts filled with a cold, desperate purpose. The hunt was on. Juliet did not sleep. She sat in the darkness of the line shack until the barest hint of grey light touched the horizon, then slipped out, leaving Ashki in his laudanum heavy sleep. When she returned to the cabin, her father was already up, a rifle in his lap, staring at the cabin door. He looked as if he hadn't slept either. "You were out early," he said. It was not a question. "Checking the snares," Juliet said, moving to the fireplace. "You've been checking those snares a lot. And the well line. And the chicken coop." Martin stood up. His shadow fell across the room. "You're a terrible liar, Juliet. Always have been." Juliet froze her back to him. "I don't know what you mean. The laudanum is missing from your mother's box. The jerky I cured last week is half gone. And that wool blanket, the good one, is gone from the line." He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His eyes were not angry. They were worse. They were terrified. "Who is he?" Martin demanded, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Father, please. Who is he?" He repeated, his hand grabbing her arm. "Is it one of them? A warrior? Are you? Are you with one of them? Are they making you?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The idea that she would willingly consort with a Navajo was so impossible, he could only assume she'd been forced, or worse, turned. "No," Juliet cried, ripping her arm away. "It's not like that. Then what is it? What are you hiding in that old dugout? You think I don't see your tracks? You think I'm that blind?" He grabbed his hat. "You've brought ruin to this house, girl. You've brought them right to our door." "Father, wait. You don't understand. Oh, I understand, Martin said, his face a mask of cold fury. He checked the load in his rifle. I understand that there is a savage on my property, and I'm going to put an end to it. He stormed out the door, walking fast toward the dugout. No, father, stop! Juliet screamed, running after him. He's just a child. He's a baby. Her words were stolen by the wind. Martin didn't slow down. He was a man possessed, driven by a fear and hatred that had been festering for years. This was the final betrayal, the proof that the world was allied against him. His own daughter. Juliet ran stumbling over the rocks, her heart clawing its way up her throat. She could see the dugout now, a low mound of earth on the horizon. Martin was 100 yards from it. She was 50 yards behind him. He's sick, she shrieked. I found him in the canyon. He was dying, father. Martin reached the dugout. He kicked the rotted half-hinged door, and it fell from its frame, crashing into the dirt. He raised his rifle, stepping into the darkness. Juliet scrambled up the hill, expecting the blast of the rifle, but there was no shot. There was only silence. She reached the dugout, breathless, her side aching. Martin was standing in the center of the small room, his rifle lowered. In the corner, Ashki was awake. The crash of the door had startled him. He was huddled under the wool blanket, his small face pale with fever, his black eyes wide with a terror so profound it had stolen his voice. Martin stared at the boy. His face, which had been set in lines of righteous fury, seemed to crumble. He looked from the child to his daughter, confusion and disgust warring in his eyes. A child, he whispered. A papoose. His name is Ashki Juliet, said, pushing past him, kneeling beside the boy. She put her body between him and her father. I told you, he was lost. I found him. You stole from me. For this, Martin's voice was full of disbelief. He gestured at the boy as if he were a diseased animal. Do you know what this is? Juliet. This is the one that lives. This is the one that grows up to scalp your neighbors, to burn your home. This is the one that comes back. He's 3 years old. She shot back, her fear turning to a hot, protective rage. It doesn't matter. It's a seed. You don't let the weed grow. He raised his rifle again, his hand shaking. We have to get rid of it, before it's found here. Get rid of him. Juliet stood up, her small frame vibrating with defiance. You mean kill him? You're going to shoot a child. It's not a child. It's an Indian, Martin roared. And it's not us that will kill him. It's them. And as he said it, a new shadow fell across the doorway. Well, ain't that the truth, Belle? Juliet's blood ran cold. Ephraim Wade filled the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Behind him stood the weasel-faced man, Lomax, holding a rifle. Both men were smiling. Looks like you found our stray Wade, said his pale eyes landing on Ashki. We've been tracking this little vermin all morning. Now be a good neighbor and step aside. We'll finish your dirty work for you. The air in the dugout became unbreathable. It was small, cramped, and suddenly full of the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and the metallic tang of fear. Martin Bell was frozen. His rifle was still pointed at the boy, but his eyes were fixed on Ephraim Wade. These were not the imaginary demons of his hatred. This was the real flesh-and-blood evil of the territory standing in his doorway. Wade Martin said, his voice a dry croak. Bell. Wade smiled, showing yellowed teeth. I see you're still scratching at this cursed land. Heard you lost your last mare. Tough break. He took a step into the dugout, forcing Martin to step back. Lomax cackled behind him. Wade's pale eyes scanned the scene, Martin rigid with conflicted rage. Juliet shielding the small, silent child, the wool blanket, the empty canteen, And you, Wade, said, his gaze lingering on Juliet. You're Martin's girl, ain't you? Got your mother's looks, got your father's hospitality. His eyes flicked to Ashki. Found yourself a pet. He's not a pet, Juliet said, her voice shaking but clear. He's a lost child. He's a bounty girl. That's all Wade said, conversationally. My associate and I were contracted to clear this area. The boy's family. They had an unfortunate accident back east. He's the last of them. We just need to tidy up. Tidy up? Juliet repeated, her stomach turning. This is my land, Wade, Martin said, finally finding his voice. He hadn't lowered his rifle, but he hadn't raised it either. He was trapped between his hatred for the child and his fear of the man. Your land, Wade laughed. You don't own anything, Martin. You're a squatter, just like them. Only difference is you got paler skin. He took another step, his shotgun now pointed loosely at Martin's chest. We tracked the boy here. That makes him ours. And that makes you too. Accessories. Harboring a hostile. Now see here, Martin began. No, you see here. Wade interrupted his voice, dropping its friendly tone, turning to iron. You give us the boy, we take him, we ride out. We forget we saw you two playing house with him. Or, we take the boy and we take the girl. Lomax here has been awful lonely. Lomax grinned his eyes, running over Juliet in a way that made her feel filthy. Martin's face went white. The choice was suddenly terribly clear. The abstract hatred he felt for the Navajo was nothing compared to the immediate vile threat posed by Wade. You ain't taken my daughter. Martin stammered, his rifle barrel shifting an inch, moving from the boy toward Wade. Not your call to make old man Wade sneered. You're outnumbered, and I know for a fact that rifle of yours has a sticky firing pin. You'll be dead before you clear your throat. He looked at Juliet. Last chance, girl. Push the papoose over here. Juliet looked at her father. She saw a broken, terrified man. She looked at Wade. She saw a monster. And she looked at Ashki, who had pressed his face into her skirts, his small hands grabbing the rough cloth. She had no choice. She had no way out. All right, Juliet, said her voice, a whisper. All right. Don't hurt my father. She nudged Ashki. Go on, she whispered, her heart breaking. Go to them. The boy whimpered, clinging to her. I said, move, Juliet, cried, shoving him harder. The boy stumbled, falling onto the dirt floor. Wade chuckled. That's a smart girl. He nodded at Lomax. Go get it. Lomax stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Martin, and bent down to grab the boy. And at that exact moment, a voice spoke from outside the dugout. It was not in English. It was a single, sharp command in Diné. Lomax froze. Wade spun around. Framed in the dugout's doorway, blotting out the sun, stood Haston. His face was painted, and in his hand, an arrow was nocked in a sinew-backed bow. The arrow was aimed directly at Ephraim Wade's throat. Behind him on the rise stood 4 other Navajo men, all armed. And just behind Haston, her face a terrifying mask of grief and authority, stood the grandmother, Astzongo-Nees. The dugout, which had been a trap, had just become a coffin. The silence was absolute. It was a 3-way standoff, a triangle of death. Hastion's bow was steady on Wade. Wade's shotgun was pointed at Hestian. Lomax, half bent, had his rifle wavering between Martin and the doorway, and Martin Bell's rifle was pointed at the floor, his world having tilted completely off its axis. As Astzongo-Nees took a single step forward, her eyes finding Ashki. The boy who had been silent with terror saw her. A single word escaped his lips. Shima Sani. Grandmother. The grandmother's iron expression cracked. Her eyes filled. Wade saw his advantage disappearing. He was a hunter, but he was also a pragmatist. 5 armed Navajo plus a settler who clearly hated him. The odds had changed. "Now hold on," Wade said, trying to smile, but it was a grimace. "We all want the same thing here. We found this boy. Wandering. We were just gonna take him to the reservation." Haston said nothing. The only sound was the faint creak of his bowstring as he drew it back another fraction of an inch. "This is a misunderstanding," Wade tried again. "We're regulators. We're on the same side as the army." As Jomo spoke, her voice, low and powerful, rattling with command. She spoke in Dene, not to Wade, but to Haston. Haston translated his English, perfect and cold. "She says you are Anahi, the enemy. She says you smell of her daughter's blood. She says you will die here." Wade's face went pale. The bluff had failed. "Lomax," he whispered, "on my count." No, Juliet moved. It wasn't a plan. It was an instinct, the same one that had made her kill the snake. She scooped up Ashki from the floor. He was heavy now, a solid weight. She held him tight to her chest, his face buried in her neck, and she stood up. "Juliet, get down!" Martin yelled. But she didn't get down. She stepped directly into the center of the dugout, placing herself between Wade and Haston, between her father and the outside world. She was in the dead zone, the place where every gun and arrow was pointed. "Stop," she said, her voice high and clear. Wade stared at her. Haston's eyes narrowed. "She saved him," Juliet said, looking directly at Haston, then at the grandmother. She didn't know if they understood her words, but they would understand the action. "I found him. He was sick. I saved him." She then turned her back completely on Wade and Lomax. It was the most dangerous and the most trusting act of her life. She was betting her life that the Navajo arrow was truer than the white man's shotgun. She faced the grandmother. As Zomo watched her, her ancient eyes reading every line of Juliet's face. She saw the fear, but she also saw the defiance. She saw the dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, and she saw her grandson clinging to this white girl, alive. Juliet took one step, then another. She walked out of the dugout past the armed Haston and into the sunlight. She walked directly to the grandmother. The two women stood face to face. The settler girl, tall and trembling. The Navajo matriarch, short, solid, and as unmovable as the canyon itself. With her hands shaking, Juliet Bell held out the child. As Zomo reached out and took her grandson. She pulled him close, buried her face in his matted hair, and for a moment her entire body shook with a silent, relieved sob. Ashki wrapped his arms around her neck, his knuckles white. Juliet stepped back, her knees weak. The transaction was complete. Inside the dugout, Wade saw his bounty, his payday, his victory walking away. He saw the girl who had defied him. He saw the warrior whose bow was still inexplicably aimed at him. His world, which was built on the simple math of violence, had been undone by a 17-year-old girl. His rage, cold and absolute, boiled over. "If I can't have the brat," he snarled, "then nobody can." He swung his shotgun not at Haston, but at the grandmother, at the child. He pulled the trigger. It was a moment of pure, chaotic violence. 3 things happened at once. The boom of Wade's shotgun echoed across the plains, a deafening blast of fire and smoke. But Wade had underestimated Martin Bell. Martin, seeing the barrel swing toward the grandmother and the child, had finally acted. He didn't fire his rifle. He lunged, driving his shoulder into Lomax and his rifle into the side of Wade's shotgun. The blast went wide, ripping a hole in the sky, peppering the dirt 6 feet to the left of the grandmother. Lomax knocked off balance, brought his own rifle up, aiming at Martin's gut. But Haston had been waiting. The moment Wade moved, the arrow was loosed. It was not a sound, but a thwip of air. The arrow crossed the 10 feet of the dugout and embedded itself deep in Ephraim Wade's chest, just below the collarbone. Wade looked down, a look of profound surprise on his face. He dropped the shotgun. He took one step, his mouth open, and fell face first onto the dirt. Lomax, seeing his boss fall, panicked. He fired his rifle, the shot going wild, burying itself in the sod roof. Before he could chamber another round, Martin Bell brought the butt of his own rifle down hard on Lomax's temple. The man collapsed like a sack of feed. Silence. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke and the sudden sharp smell of blood. Outside, the grandmother hadn't flinched. She stood clutching Ashki, her back rigid. The other Navajo warriors had their bows raised, but Huston held up a hand. Martin Bell stumbled out of the dugout, breathing hard. His arm was bleeding. Lomax's wild shot had grazed him, tearing a long, bloody furrow in his forearm. He was pale, but he was standing. He looked at Huston. Huston looked back at him. They were two fathers, two protectors who had just dispatched a common enemy. No words were spoken. Huston walked past Martin into the dugout. He looked at Wade's body, then at the unconscious Lomax. He pulled a knife from his belt. Martin tensed, but Huston only bent down and retrieved his arrow from Wade's chest, wiping it clean on the dead man's shirt. He looked at Lomax for a moment, as if deciding, then left him. A problem for the white world. He emerged back into the sun. Asdomoneez spoke to him, her voice quiet. He nodded. The grandmother, still holding Ashki, looked at Juliet. Then she looked at Martin, at the blood dripping from his arm. She looked at the land at the cabin, and then back at Juliet. She gave a short, sharp nod. It was not thanks. It was an acknowledgement. A fact had been established. Then, without a backward glance, the grandmother Hostin and the other warriors melted back into the landscape heading north. In moments they were gone, as if they had never been. Juliet and Martin were left alone, standing in the bright, terrible sunlight with the smoking shotgun, two bodies in their dugout, and the overwhelming silence of the desert. Martin looked at his bleeding arm. He looked at his daughter, who was covered in dust and shaking from head to toe. "Juliet," he said, his voice raw. Go fetch the bandages from your mother's box." He sat down heavily on a rock, his rifle across his knees. He didn't look at the dugout. He just stared at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. 3 days passed. A cavalry patrol drawn by a tip from a settler had come and gone. They found Ephraim Wade's body. They took the groggy, captive Lomax. The lieutenant, a young man from Boston, wrote in his report that the notorious regulator Ephraim Wade had been killed in an altercation with his own man, presumed over a dispute of payment. The West was simple if you wrote it that way. The lieutenant had questioned Martin Bell, who claimed he'd heard the shots and found the bodies. The lieutenant had looked at Martin's bandaged arm, at Juliet's pale, set face, and decided he did not want to know any more. He tipped his hat and left. A tense, brittle peace settled over the homestead. Martin was quiet. He hadn't spoken of the incident. He just worked his arm in a sling, his face grim. The hatred in him, that solid rock, had been shattered. He didn't know what to replace it with, so he was filled with a vast, aching emptiness. He no longer looked at the canyon with hatred. He didn't look at it at all. On the morning of the 4th day, Juliet was feeding the chickens when she saw the rider. A single figure on a grey-muzzled pony, coming not from the road, but from the north, from the canyon. Martin came out of the cabin, his rifle in his good hand. It was Adzomo-Neez, the grandmother. She was alone. She rode directly up to the cabin and dismounted, her movements stiff but deliberate. She was not armed. She carried only a small buckskin bundle. Martin stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely. Juliet stood by the coupe. The old woman ignored Martin. She walked directly to Juliet. She stopped a few feet away, her black eyes locking with Juliet's. She said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. Then slowly the grandmother unwrapped the bundle. Inside, resting on the soft deer hide, was a silver bracelet. It was not a new, shiny thing. It was old, heavy, and clearly powerful. It was a wide cuff of hammered silver, stamped with the symbols for rain and for the path of the sun. In its center was a single massive stone of turquoise, the color of a mountain sky, webbed with a black matrix. It was a piece of great value, an heirloom, a piece of a person's soul. As Zomo Nees took the bracelet, she reached out, and with a rough, warm hand, she took Juliet's left wrist. Juliet did not pull away. The grandmother slid the heavy cuff onto Juliet's arm. It was cool against her skin, and it settled on her wrist with a sense of profound weight. As Nees held Juliet's wrist for a moment, her thumb resting on the turquoise. She looked into Juliet's eyes, and her expression was not one of gratitude. It was not one of friendship. It was one of acknowledgement, a sealing of a pact. A debt had been paid. A life for a life. She released Juliet's arm. She nodded once, a gesture of finality. She turned, mounted her pony, and rode away back toward the canyon, never once looking back. Juliet and Martin stood and watched until she was a speck, then gone. Juliet looked down at the bracelet. The silver was bright and foreign against her sun-browned skin. It felt heavy like a manacle, but also like a shield. Martin came down from the porch, stopping beside her. He looked at the bracelet. "You know what that is, don't you?" he said, his voice quiet. "It's a gift," Juliet whispered. "No." Martin shook his head. "It's not. It's a mark. It's a sign. To them, it means you are a friend. You are Dine Yaatehi, one who is good to the people. They will not harm you. They will protect this land, and you with it." He looked out at the canyon, and to every other white man in this territory, to the men who rode with Wade, to the ranchers who paid him. He looked back at his daughter, his eyes filled with a new, terrible fear, but also for the first time, a profound respect. "It means you're a target. It means you're a traitor. You've chosen a side, Juliet, and you're marked by it." Juliet didn't answer. She just stood in the hot white sun, the unfamiliar weight of enemy silver on her arm. She felt the heavy beating heart of the turquoise against her pulse. Her father was right. She was marked. The dust, the silence, and the violence of the land were no longer just a backdrop to her life. They were in her blood, and now they were on her skin. Her life as a simple settler's daughter was over. The story of Juliet Bell and the silver bracelet isn't a tale of the Wild West you see in movies. It's a story of the real West, a place where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by dust and desperation, and where survival often meant making impossible choices. Juliet didn't just save a child, she defied her own world, and in doing so was branded by another. That silver bracelet was both a shield and a target, a symbol of a fragile, dangerous peace bought with blood and courage. These are the stories that built the frontier, not with bank robberies and saloon fights, but with quiet, terrifying moments of human connection in a world determined to tear itself apart. If this story of courage and conflict resonated with you, please hit the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates real history and powerful drama. And to make sure you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten corners of the past, please subscribe to our channel and ring that bell. Thank you for listening.